So I want to talk about why I chose SwiftUI to build my app instead of Flutter or React Native or some web-based tool, even though I've been a web developer for the past 15 years, and whether or not I regret this choice in the end because my app is now live on the App Store and rewriting it from scratch is not really an option anymore. And let's first look at what options you have these days in terms of technologies for building an iOS app. First, you can go native with Swift and SwiftUI. Then there are pure web technologies, JavaScript, TypeScript with React, Angular, Vue, whatever, plus something like Ionic that gives you a native app wrapper. Then of course React Native, kind of a hybrid between the previous two. You code your app using web technologies, but then it compiles into native components. And finally, the anarchist choice, Flutter, where the framework says to the OS, just give me a blank canvas on the screen and I'll draw every single pixel myself, and all the gestures and events, I'll handle all of those as well. That's roughly the landscape. Now, I'll give you my opinion about each of those options, and I'll start with web technologies because for me, it's the clearest cut out of all of those. I think it's the worst option you can choose to build a mobile app. As I mentioned before, I have a 15 years of professional experience as a web developer, and I know quite well strong and weak points of the modern web stack, and I can say for sure interactive UIs are not the strongest point of this technology. And it's definitely not the platform's fault, it was just built and optimized for different things, and we as an industry collectively for the past decade trying to force it to do something that it was not meant for. Web technologies starting from very fundamentals are heavily optimized for information, for content, right? Text on the web is the highest priority. Layout engine lays out by default everything in a single column vertically because text is most often laid out this way. Styling for a page usually loaded separately so that the user sees the text as quickly as possible. Custom fonts, images, including icons, scripts for user interactions are all lower priority on the web and by default loaded separately and after the textual content. So when you open pretty much any site that claims to be a web application, you see that it jumps around for a few seconds and there are all those spinners and placeholders while it loads all the resources to display a proper UI. And on the web we get used to this and no one really cares that much because again people come for content and information and nice user experience is kind of nice to have. But if you open a mobile app and everything shifts and jumps around for 3 seconds, you'd say it's a garbage app, right? And of course, I'm not saying that it's impossible to build a nice fluid experience using web stack. It's definitely possible. It just requires much more effort because I need to constantly fight those inherent defaults of the platform. And for apps that I want to build, they're not about content, so web technologies are just not the right tool for the job. Now, about frameworks like Ionic that wrap websites into native applications and provide bridges to operating system, they do the best they can to hide this text-based identity of the web, which I think results in a lot of unnecessary code and a bunch of workarounds that make a resulting app much buggier and slower. And they go as far as providing you with component libraries to make your app look native, and in a lot of cases they do the best they can, but to be honest I think most people while using those components would still feel that something is off even if they couldn't articulate what exactly is wrong there. And so of course all those tiny details that do not exactly match system components that people are used to, like padding between elements, timing of animations, look of the materials, this kind of stuff. All of this combined makes the app look and feel like you're using a cheap knockoff version. And I would recommend to go straight for a completely custom design instead of trying to mimic system UIs. And by the way, Flutter, which I'm going to talk about next, has a few similar issues. Now, I don't have much practical experience with Flutter, but I'm aware of its general approach. So if you don't know, Flutter does everything on its own, like layout, rendering, handling of users' inputs. All of that stuff is written from scratch by the Flutter team. And developers who use Flutter also need to write in a special language called Dart. And there is still a layer that is specific to every OS, but it's relatively lean compared to everything else, and that's how they achieve cross-platformness, right? In some sense, they kind of do a similar thing to the approach with web technologies, where web browser is your rendering engine and all the other stuff, but Flutter goes one step further and eliminates all the middle layers between itself and the OS. Similar to what games are doing. They also have just a canvas from the system and they can do whatever they want. And I have to say I respect this bold approach. It's a huge engineering challenge to write all of that from scratch. It's probably a lot of fun as well, at least in the beginning, before all the tech debt has accumulated. But I still have a couple of fundamental issues with Flutter, why I haven't and wouldn't choose it to build my apps, at least on iOS. First, by deciding to render everything on its own and by using its own programming language, Flutter throws away all the components and patterns provided by the system. There is no technical way for me to reuse any of the system UIs, meaning it will be really hard to make sure that my app feels native. And of course, Flutter team also understands this, so they came up with Cupertino widgets and material widgets, component libraries that mimic native UIs for iOS and Android. And with material widgets, it's more or less clear because Flutter, Android, and material UI are all Google, so there is at least a chance that those teams will coordinate internally and come up with something cohesive. But for iOS, I think if you are not Apple and you're even thinking to copy their components, you have already lost. The resulting UI will never be exactly the same in the first place, but even then Apple is constantly adjusting and tweaking stuff. You will never be able to keep up with this moving targets, and one day eventually there will be a major iOS redesign and you would need to do a bunch of work just to be at square one, which was not perfect to start with. Integration with the OS features is another huge concern for me. On iOS, it would be stuff like access to phones' hardware, including new ones like iPhone's action button last year and most probably camera button this year, and also system frameworks like live activities, health kits, push notifications, store kit for all the in-app purchases. In Flutter, all of those require third-party plugins that have a bunch of code that bridge system features into my app. So not only this introduces another middleman into my code base, but I also need to rely on those plugins to keep up with OS changes and also not to have bugs on top of bugs in the native APIs. Doesn't sound like a robust system, to be honest. There is still another reason why I think Flutter, along with all other non-native solutions, is a dead end, at least for iOS apps, but it requires a bit more context about Swift and SwiftUI, and I still want to talk about React Native first. Now, if for some reason I have no other choice but to build a cross-platform app, I would choose React Native, mostly because it's the only one that leverages native UI components and frameworks. But if you think how it does that, there is my code in JavaScript or TypeScript, then there is a layer that bridges native APIs, then another layer with JavaScript runtime that runs all of that code, then another layer with React Native renderer that converts all of that into native components, lays them out, and finally calls the OS to render the UI. The amount of indirection here between my code and the final result is a bit too much, I think. And fundamentally, the whole setup here suffers from the same issues as Flutter, because that layer that bridges native API into my app also relies on third-party packages that are maintained by random developers and community without a clear incentive to keep them up to date. So it's only a matter of time when some of those packages go stale and start accumulating bugs. And on top of that, React Native renderer is another middle party here that will have its own bugs and weird behaviors as any software does. And at the end, you will be left trying to debug native code using native tooling that you have no clue about, because the whole appeal of React Native is to use familiar web technologies to build native apps, right? So if you go React Native route, set your expectations that you will get 80% there with just web technologies and the knowledge that you can directly transfer from building React apps on the web into the native world. But for that final 20%, you would need to have some understanding of native runtime. Most probably you need to write a bit of Swift or Objective-C, or at least debug the code in those languages. And as usual, those 20% of the effort might actually take 80% of your time. So just make sure to account for that. But I didn't choose React Native only because of those reasons I just talked about. There is one other thing that I think makes Swift and SwiftUI the only good option to build iOS apps at the moment. Now, even besides not having the flaws that I described for web, React Native and Flutter, like not using system components and frameworks, extra middlewares between my code and the end result, or relying on a bunch of third-party code, there are still 4 other reasons why I prefer Swift and SwiftUI to build my iOS apps. 3 of those reasons are super subjective, and I know a lot of people won't agree with me. We can take it offline, I won't go deep into them in this video. And there is one objective reason that is just a reality of developing for Apple platforms these days. Okay, 3 objective ones. Swift is a better programming language than JavaScript, TypeScript, or Dart. SwiftUI is a better UI framework than React or any other framework on the web. Xcode is a better IDE than VS Code or any JetBrains product. Again, won't talk about those right now. Moving on to the last objective point, which is increasingly you just cannot build certain features or even whole apps without Swift and SwiftUI. It's your only option. I mean, home screen and lock screen widgets, app intents and shortcuts, the new control center widgets in iOS 18, 2 whole operating systems, watchOS and visionOS, are basically Swift and SwiftUI exclusive. It just doesn't make sense to build your main app in React Native or Flutter and miss out on all that experience that you could have gained building in SwiftUI, the experience that you're still going to need in order to build all that stuff that go outside of the main app. And these days, very few apps can afford not to have a holistic integration with the system. People just expect all of those features as a baseline. And I mean, I totally understand the appeal to target twice as many people with their single code base, but at least for indie developers, I would argue, instead of spreading yourself too thin and delivering a mediocre quality on 2 platforms, if you put all your effort into a single platform that you use yourself and understand best, you would reach much more people anyways. And again, in the context of indie development, you can consider number of people on iOS basically infinite. No matter how popular your next app will be, you will likely never exhaust potential new users in your target audience. I hope my reasoning somewhat makes sense. Happy to discuss in the comments. Thank you for watching. Cheers.